We'll be discussing the Safe Drinking Water Act. The original act was published in 1974. Before that, in 1969, there was a study published that stated that 56% of the water systems were deficient. In that time, part of the reason for this study is there were 130 outbreaks of disease or poisoning attributed to the water system. This included 20 deaths. When the bill went forward to President Ford for signature, as the bill was going to his desk, carcinogens were found in New Orleans. And although he had vetoed similar bills, there was an amounted pressure from these health risks to pass this legislation. The major provisions of the SDWA, or Safe Drinking Water Act, included that the EPA, which had been formed in 1970, should issue primary standards, which were related to public health risk, and secondary standards, which were related to aesthetic or economic qualities. The primary health standard would include E. coli or pathogens, whereas a secondary example might be color. The Act also included a right to know clause, which stated that any time a primary standard was violated, the public should be notified. It protected state primacy so that first states would issue the regulations, and only if they did not uphold the federal standards would standards be enforced. It required the protection of groundwater supplies, which are sole source aquifers for drinking water, and it provided funds for the states to create programs under this act. Without this provision, without funds, this would have been considered an unfunded mandate, and there's typically a lot of criticism for that. Now, there are two maximum contaminant levels that are defined under the Act. The first is a goal, and goals only have to consider health risk. These are not enforceable. The second is the actual enforceable standard, and these must balance cost with health risk. It also defined what would be considered a public water system and would be held to this standard. You need to know this definition. A public water supply is any supply that serves 25 or more people or has 15 or more year-round service connections. This would include a private resort that had more than 15 service connections. Although it is private, the water system would be considered a public water system and under the purview of the Safe Drinking Water Act. For much of environmental legislation, you'll see that there are amendments that are added after the original passage. We'll review some of the amendments to understand what the current state of the Safe Drinking Water Act is. In 1986, the First Amendment was passed under President Reagan's administration, and part of the impetus for this was that there had been many delays and lawsuits that had delayed the actual provision of maximum contaminant levels. So in the 1986 provision, the EPA was directed by Congress to provide 83 contaminant standards within the first 3 years. Congress then directed the EPA to establish 25 more regulations every 3 years after that. This provision was dropped in 1992 because EPA could not fulfill. We will be looking at the current standards at EPA's webpage in class. The amendment also directed the establishment of best available technologies for each regulated contaminant, and it specified when filtration of surface water is required. It stated that all public water supplies must perform disinfection. For contaminants that are not regulated, it required monitoring of the contaminants at least once in every 5 years. This provides data for the need of future regulations. And also in this provision, it banned lead from any pipes used in new installations. It did not require replacement of old infrastructure. There was another amendment in 1996. This amendment provided more appropriations to help states meet the SDWA, and it also provided new provisions. It required annual consumer confidence reports be provided for all citizens within a public water supply. These consumer confidence reports compare the data from the last year with federal drinking water standards. We will review these in class. It also established the risk-based process for selecting contaminants for regulation. All new environmental regulations after this point must include an assessment of the costs and benefits. This is what we have already learned, and this was enacted in the 1990s. The specific language is that the EPA administrator must maximize health risk reduction benefits at a cost justified by those benefits. Prior to this legislation, cost was not considered in the setting of limits, but afterward, that balancing of cost and benefits has been standard. In general, when the EPA propagates a new standard, it goes through the following 5 steps. First, the EPA issues an advance notice of public rulemaking. This announces intentions and allows stakeholders to consider the impacts of a new regulation. Then the EPA proposes the numeric criteria and also the monitoring requirements. These can add a burden on the utilities. For instance, if the monitoring requirement is every 15 minutes, this would create backlash for certain samples. After this numeric criteria monitoring is propagated, the EPA takes comments and holds public hearings, and this is when stakeholders provide feedback. Finally, the EPA enacts the final maximum contaminant level goal, maximum contaminant levels, or a treatment technology, a best available technology, and monitoring requirements. This process can take years. The last step that generally happens, although it's perhaps pessimistic to call it a natural step, is that stakeholders who are unhappy with the final ruling often file lawsuits and litigation occurs. The EPA often responds to this litigation, or it goes through our judicial branch for litigation to be upheld. In the next video, I'll review some specific aspects of the Safe Drinking Water Act regarding lead, copper, and disinfection byproducts.